Suggestions for teaching, promoting multicultural understanding and classroom achievement. Use culturally relevant teaching methods. To fulfill the goals of multicultural education, teachers should practice what is referred to as either culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally responsive pedagogy. This approach to instruction is based on two premises. First, all students, regardless of their ethnic, racial, and social class backgrounds, have assets they can use to aid their learning. Second, teachers need to be aware of and meet students' academic needs in any number of ways. In other words, simply adopting a multicultural basal reader is not culturally responsive pedagogy. In addition to adopting multicultural reading material, you should do everything possible to help all students learn to read. For example, successful teachers of Latino students in Arizona and California have high expectations for students, make their expectations clear, never accept low-quality work, scaffold students' learning, and use Spanish for instruction, or allow students to speak Spanish among themselves when working in pairs or groups. Ladson Billings, who has written extensively about working with minority and at-risk students, provides several examples of culturally relevant or responsive teaching. A second-grade teacher allowed her students to bring in lyrics from rap songs that both she and the students deemed to be inoffensive. The students performed the songs, and the teacher and students discussed the literal and figurative meanings of the words and such aspects of poetry as rhyme scheme, alliteration, and onomatopoeia. The students acquired an understanding of poetry that exceeded both the state's and school district's learning standards. Another teacher invited the parents of her students to conduct seminars in class for 2 to 4 days, 1 to 2 hours at a time. One parent, who was famous for the quality of her sweet potato pie, taught the students how to make one. In addition, the students were required to complete such related projects as a written report on George Washington Carver's research on the sweet potato, a marketing plan for selling pies, and a statement of the kind of education and experience one needed to become a cook or chef. Similar seminars were done by a carpenter, a former professional basketball player, a licensed practical nurse, and a church musician, all of whom were parents or relatives of the students. Help make students aware of the contributions the specific ethnic groups have made to the development of the United States and the rest of the world. As we noted earlier, James Banks has identified 4 approaches to multicultural education, the first of which is the contributions approach. This approach emphasizes the contributions that prominent individuals of various ethnic groups have made to the United States, as well as each group's major holidays, celebrations, and customs. One suggestion for implementing this approach is to invite family members of students and other local residents of different ethnic backgrounds to the classroom. Ask them to describe the values subscribed to by members of their group and explain how those values have contributed to the life in the United States and the rest of the world. Use instructional techniques and classroom activities that are consistent with the value system of students who share a particular cultural background and that encourage students to learn from and about one another's cultures. Students from Latino cultures place a high value on the concept of collectivism, or the interdependence of family members. From an early age, children are taught to think first about fostering the success of any group to which they belong by seeking to work cooperatively with others. To capitalize on this value, consider doing some or all of the following. Assign 2 or 3 children rather than just one to a classroom task, such as cleaning up after an art period, and allow them to help one another if necessary. Increase the use of choral reading with students whose English proficiency is limited, so they can practice their decoding and pronunciation skills without being the center of attention. After distributing a homework assignment, allow students to discuss the questions, but not to write down the answers. Those who are more proficient in English and have better developed intellectual skills can help their less skilled classmates better understand the task. One third grade teacher who used this technique was surprised to find that every student completed the assignment. Bear in mind, however, that students whose families have recently immigrated to the United States may not be familiar or comfortable with such student-centered techniques. In some cultures, for example, students are taught not to speak unless asked a direct question by the teacher, not to volunteer answers without being asked, so as not to appear boastful or conceited, and never to question what the teacher says, even when they know it to be wrong. If you have Asian students in your class who have recently immigrated, you may also want to be cautious about using writing software that allows classmates to edit each other's work online. Because of the importance of maintaining face, one's public image, students in Singapore were quite resistant to the prospect of publicly correcting a classmate. These students will need time to become used to such practices as working with other students, asking the teacher for additional explanations, and evaluating the work of peers. At the secondary level, involve students in activities that explore cultural differences in perceptions, beliefs, and values. A well-conceived multicultural education program cannot and should not avoid or minimize the use of cultural conflict. There are at least two reasons for helping students examine this issue. One is that conflict has been a constant and salient aspect of relationships among cultural groups. Another is that cultural conflicts often produce changes that benefit all members of a society. A prime example is the civil rights movement of the 1960s, with its boycotts, marches, and demonstrations. Cultural conflicts arise from differences in perceptions, beliefs, and values. American culture, for example, places great value on self-reliance. Americans generally respect and praise individuals who, through their own initiative, persistence, and ingenuity, achieve substantial personal goals, and they tend to look down on individuals who are dependent on others for their welfare. Consequently, American parents who are financially dependent on their children, even though the children may be prosperous enough to support them, would probably feel ashamed enough to hide the fact. The same situation in China would likely elicit a different reaction because of different values about self-reliance and family responsibilities. Chinese parents who are unable to provide for themselves in their old age, but have children successful enough to support them, might well brag about it to others. One technique for exploring cultural conflict is to have students search through newspapers and news magazines for articles that describe clashes. Ask them to identify the source of the conflict and how it might be positively resolved. Another technique is to involve students in games that simulate group conflict. Class members can, for example, play the role of state legislatures who represent the interests of diverse ethnic groups and who have been lobbied to change the school funding formula so that poorer school districts receive more money. The use of both simulations and the discussion of newspaper articles will probably work best at the high school level because adolescents are better able than young students to understand the abstract concepts involved in these activities. Involve students, especially at the secondary level, in community service activities. Service learning programs found in many school systems serve several purposes. First, they afford students the opportunity to broaden the knowledge they acquire in school by working to solve real-world problems in a community setting. As a result, students who participate in service programs earn higher grades and improve their social skills. Second, they help students develop a sense of civic and social responsibility. Third, they help students become more knowledgeable about career options. And fourth, they provide a useful and needed service to the community. To cite one example, Natalie Russell, who teaches English as a second language to high school students, describes how she uses service learning projects, such as the creation of a Spanish-English phrasebook that was distributed free to community members, and as a way to help students feel more connected to their community, and to make their English lessons more meaningful and immediately useful. More detailed information about service learning programs and organizations can be found on the Corporation for National and Community Service website. Make every effort to contact and work with the parents of ethnic minority students. To help students and their parents make a successful transition to a new country and school system, educators and multicultural education scholars suggest trying the following. During the first week of the school year, hold parent-teacher-child conferences. Be willing to hold these meetings in the parent's home and during the evening hours if necessary. Recruit bilingual parent volunteers to help teachers and staff members talk with parents and students. In discussing classroom tasks and student performance with parents, avoid technical terminology and acronyms. Not only does this result in fewer misunderstandings, but it also lessens the sense of inferiority that some parents feel. Participate in the cultural events hosted by your students' community. Recruit community members to help your students with culture-specific projects that you would like the students to carry out. Improving practice through inquiry, one teacher's story. Leveling the background knowledge playing field by Carol April. Research on the reading process has shown that building background knowledge is an essential ingredient for comprehension. As a reading teacher in a small rural community that is home to a liberal arts college, I am constantly faced with the challenge of teaching students who represent different socioeconomic levels and cultural backgrounds. The amount and type of my students' schema or prior knowledge varies in every grade and in every class in the school. To complement the 5th grade curriculum, I chose the Newbery Honor book, A Long Way from Chicago by Robert Peck, to read with a group of 6 students. This historical fiction is a novel in stories about 2 children who spend summer vacations with their grandmother during the 1930s. The development of the main characters is masterful, but in order to fully understand and appreciate these characters, particularly Grandma Dowdle, having some background knowledge and understanding of the time and place, the setting of this story is rural Illinois, are crucial. Some of my students didn't know where Illinois is located, whereas others have traveled across the United States. How could I engage my students and help strengthen their comprehension at the same time? Each chapter in A Long Way from Chicago centers on a specific item or person from the time period. For example, one chapter talks about an outhouse, another mentions a gunny sack, another describes baking with gooseberries, a picture of a biplane adorns the cover of the book, and Joy, one of the main characters, covers the Hudson terraplane. He covets the terraplane. The effects of the Great Depression are mentioned, and there are references to John D. Rockefeller and John Dillinger. Knowing what these things are, understanding how the time period affected the story, and learning a bit about the historical figures became crucial teaching points for me. I wanted my students to love this book, and I knew that somehow I had to build background for them to do so. I decided that for each of these specific items mentioned, along with others, I would ask one student to become the expert of the class. This meant that the student would research the item and prepare a short presentation for the group, which included a description of the assigned piece of information, a visual aid, and the connection to the text. Students were excited to use technology. They have access to computers, iPads, and printers, and were free to determine how they wanted to share their new information, and felt honored to be the expert for the day. This was a huge success. With confidence and creativity, each student gave a short presentation to the class when his or her researched item appeared in the text. By allowing them to lead the discussion and help extend the knowledge of their peers, a sense of cohesiveness evolved within the group. Students were able to take ownership of their learning, gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of the book, and I'm happy to say love the story as much as I do. My students begged to read the sequel, A Year Down Yonder, but we ran out of time. Next year, I'll be sure to allow sufficient time to read both books, with experts leading discussions right along with me. Carol April is a reading specialist at Hamilton Central School. As we mentioned earlier, the 2000s set a U.S. record for the number of immigrants during a decade. Slightly more than 10.2 million legal immigrants arrived in the United States from 2000 through 2009. Not surprisingly, many of the school-aged children of these families have either limited or no English proficiency. For 2009-2010, 4.7 million K through 12 students, about 10% of all students, were classified as English language learners. To address the needs of these students, the federal government provides financial support for the establishment of bilingual education programs. Because language is viewed as an important part of a group's culture, many school districts integrate bilingual education with multicultural education. In this section, we will examine the nature and effectiveness of bilingual education programs. Before we consider different approaches to bilingual education, there are three general points we would like you to keep in mind. Bilingual programs have become an emotionally charged and politicized topic. Educators, parents, and legislators have strong opinions regarding the amount of time and resources that should be devoted to helping students master native language skills, and whether such programs should include cultural awareness goals. Some people favor moving students into all English classes as quickly as possible, whereas others believe that students should have a firm grasp of their native language and English before attempting to make the transition to regular classes. Although research on this issue is helpful because it informs us about what is, such research cannot tell us what we should do about what we know. Some language minority students may suffer from problems that bilingual education alone cannot solve, such as the multiple difficulties associated with low SES. No one approach to bilingual education is likely to be equally effective for all language minority students. What works well for some low SES Puerto Rican children may not work well for middle SES Cuban children, and vice versa. Goals and approaches. Most bilingual education programs have a common long-term goal, but they differ in their approach to that goal. The goal is to help minority language students acquire as efficiently as possible the English skills they will need to succeed in school and society. The approaches to that goal usually fall into one of three categories: transition, maintenance, and two-way bilingual. Transition programs. Programs that take a transition approach teach students wholly, in the case of non-English proficient students, or partly in the case of limited English proficient students, in their native language so as not to impede their academic progress, but only until they can function adequately in English. At that point, they are placed in regular classes in which all the instruction is in English. To make the transition time as brief as possible, some programs add an English as a second language component. ESOL programs typically involve pulling students out of their regular classes and providing them with full-time intensive instruction in English. Maintenance programs. Programs that take a maintenance approach try to maintain or improve students' native language skills. Instruction in the student's native language continues for a significant time before transition to English. Supporters of maintenance programs point to the results of psychological and linguistic studies that suggest that a strong native language foundation supports the subsequent learning of English and subject matter knowledge. In addition, many proponents of multicultural education favor a maintenance approach because they see language as an important part of a group's cultural heritage. Two-way bilingual programs. Some bilingual education scholars are critical of both transitional and maintenance bilingual education programs because they are remedial and because students who participate in such programs tend to be perceived as inferior in some respect. These educators favor what is generally known as two-way bilingual education, although the term bilingual immersion, two-way immersion, and dual language are also used. In a TWB program, subject matter instruction is provided in two languages to all students. This approach is typically used when English is the primary language of about half the students in a school, and the other language, usually Spanish, is the primary language of the other half of the students. TWB programs are used in 346 schools in 27 states in the United States. For applied, yes. Although most of these programs are English-Spanish, other programs include Korean, French, Cantonese, Navajo, Japanese, Arabic, Portuguese, Russian, and Mandarin Chinese as the minority language. TWB programs differ from traditional transition and ESOL programs in that they begin as early as kindergarten and continue throughout the elementary school years to maintain facility in the student's native language while building facility in the non-native language. Canada and Miami, Florida have two of the oldest and largest TWB programs. Canada has always had a large French-speaking population, mostly in the province of Quebec. Because many parents wanted their children to be proficient in both English and French, Canadian schools in the 1960s began a K-12 program. In kindergarten and first grade, 90% of the instruction is in French, and the remaining 10% is in English. From grade 2 through grade 5, the proportion shifts gradually to 50-50. By grade 6, most students can work equally well on any subject matter in either language. The impetus for a TWB program in the Miami area was the large number of residents who immigrated from Cuba. As with all other two-way programs, students whose primary language is Spanish and students whose primary language is English participate in the program together. Unlike the Canadian model, which has a strong immersion component in the early grades, 80 to 90% of instruction is in French. Teachers in Miami's programs teach in Spanish for half the day and in English for the other half of the day at all grade levels. TWB programs typically include the following features: at least 6 years of bilingual instruction, high quality instruction in both languages, separation of the two languages for instruction, for example, by time of day, day of the week, or even by week. Use the minority language for teaching and classroom discussion at least 50% of the time. A roughly balanced percentage of students for whom each language is primary. And use of peer tutoring. Despite the growth and success of TWB programs, as well as data showing that it takes most English learners 5 to 7 years to become sufficiently fluent in English to compete academically with their peers, some states, Arizona, California, and Massachusetts, for example, have eliminated or severely restricted bilingual education programs. As a replacement, they typically provide a one-year English immersion program in which language minority students are taught only in English. An English immersion program was approved in Massachusetts in 2002, but was later amended to allow TWB programs to continue to operate. Research findings. Much of the research on bilingual education has addressed one or the other of the following questions. Do English language learners become proficient in English more quickly in bilingual programs or in English-only immersion programs? Do English language learners score higher on subject matter tests in bilingual programs or immersion programs? Before we get into a brief summary of this research, a word of caution. As with all of the other topics we cover in this book, the research on bilingual education is complex and evolving. What follows is, to use a photography metaphor, a snapshot of what we currently know. Nevertheless, the weight of the evidence to date seems to support the following conclusions. Despite heated arguments about whether immersion programs or transition programs, the most common form of bilingual instruction, help ELLs acquire English proficiency more quickly, the answer, at least for now, seems to be that it may not matter very much. In one large-scale study, about 800 kindergarten Spanish-speaking ELLs were randomly assigned to one of 4 types of programs: regular transition, enhanced transition, regular immersion, enhanced immersion. The main difference between the regular and enhanced versions of the transition and immersion program was additional daily English instruction activities. After 2 years, the students in the 2 enhanced groups were equally proficient in English, and both groups were more proficient than students in the traditional translation group, or transition group. In comparison with immersion, English-only programs, participation in bilingual education programs produces small to moderate gains in reading, language skills, mathematics, and total achievement when measured by tests in English. When measured by tests administered in the student's native language, participation in bilingual education leads to significantly better performance on tests of listening comprehension, reading, writing, total language, mathematics, social studies, and attitudes towards school and self, thus increasing the amount of time devoted to instruction in English, as is done in immersion programs, does not necessarily lead to higher levels of achievement. Early analysis of California's immersion program indicates that although ELL students improve their scores on the Stanford 9, a standardized achievement test, the scores of non-ELL students increase by a similar amount. Consequently, the achievement gap between ELL and non-ELL students remained unchanged. An analysis of how third-grade ELL students in Massachusetts performed on the language and reading literature portions of their state's standardized test before and after that state's immersion program went into effect showed, as in the California case, almost no overall difference in language skills and reading proficiency. In other words, neither a transition bilingual approach nor an English immersion approach produced a generally superior outcome. Students who participate in TWB programs score at or above grade level on subject matter tests and score higher on reading and mathematics tests than ELL students who are taught only in English. Bilingual education, take a stand. The preceding French phrase translates to, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So it is with the current dispute over the goals and methods of bilingual education. In the early part of the 20th century, prior to World War I, bilingual public schools were common, particularly in areas with large numbers of German immigrants. After the war, however, public financing of bilingual schools was abruptly withdrawn, partly as a reaction against Germany, which lost the war and was seen as the aggressor, and partly because of increasing nationalism and isolationism. American society strongly endorsed a one country, one culture policy and stressed once again the idea of America as a melting pot. As a result, English immersion programs for immigrant students became the norm. But during and after World War II, as now American students' deficiencies in foreign language fluency became noticeable and a source of concern. This situation contributed to the first Bilingual Education Act in 1965, which emphasized the maintenance of one's native language as well as master of English. As a future educator whose decisions will rest partly on scientific evidence, we suggest that you ignore as much as possible both the pro and con arguments about bilingual education that appear to be based on biases and political beliefs. Focus instead on what the research has to say. Our reading of the current research leads us to conclude that bilingual education, particularly in the form of two-way bilingual programs, benefits both limited English proficient and native English-speaking students, given the ease with which technology allows students from different countries to communicate and work collaboratively, as well as the trend toward international commerce. Programs that increase students' bilingual fluency should be encouraged and strongly supported. Have you ever taken part in bilingual education? What is your position on expanding its use in U.S. schools? It seems like it would take away from the basics.